Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey of My Mother's Son podcast. I'm joined with fellow podcast host Nikki LaCroce. Nikki, thanks for joining me today.
Yes, thanks so much. I appreciate it, Dan. I'm excited to be here. It is nice to be speaking with somebody who is located in my home state of PA.
Absolutely looking forward to it. And actually, in the state of PA while we're recording this, which isn't always the case, we're recording on the road. But, um, you know, before I have you introduce yourself, I just want to kind of give a little background. I was really looking forward to having you on the show because I think our shows are very similar in the fact that
Definitely.
we just, are having conversations with people and allowing them to tell their stories. And I think that's what's so powerful about the platform of podcasting is just giving people a voice where they can tell their story in their own words without kind of directing the narrative or anything like that. So as soon as I saw you on Pod Match, I was like, there's definitely some synergy here. And again, a Pennsylvania native, so it just made a lot of sense to get you on the show. So once again, thanks for joining me. And I'm looking forward to this. But before we get started, just introduce yourself. Who is Nikki today?
Oh, that's a very great and a little loaded question. I will say that I appreciate your comment just before about the narrative and giving people control over that for themselves. It's something that I say a lot when I speak to guests is that, this is your story and I want you to tell it your way. And so I really admire that you're doing the same thing. And you're 100% right about podcasting being a really great medium for that. And also, I found that there's just so much good energy between podcasters. It's really fun to be on this side of the mic when you are typically hosting. I find out so much more about myself sometimes when I'm on this side. It's a little bit like a therapy session. It's like, you go through these conversations and you think, okay, we kind of have a way that we like to tell our story, but it really depends on the direction that the conversation's going. And I think because so many hosts really lean into that organic approach that you tend to find out more about yourself as you go through the process, and you're asked different questions by people that prompt thoughts that you may have never had. And so who I am today is um, a podcaster full time at this point, doing some e-commerce things on the side with my wife, who's had a business for about 12 years doing that. But it beyond the work of it all, so to speak. I am someone who has worked very hard to answer that question, who am I? The name of the podcast that I have, if I'm allowed to curse here, is may I?
Go ahead.
It's who the fuck, and it came quite literally from asking myself the question, who the fuck am I? Like, what do I like? What do I believe? Is this what I want to believe? Is this who I truly believe that I am? And going really deep on the the parts of myself that I thought I understood, but then started to really look inward more and say, okay, some of this is the way that I was raised, or some of this is the circumstances that dictated the way that I behaved. And now that I have a bit more of a clear view and I have some objectivity to it, what is it that I want to keep from that? And what is it that I want to change from that? And so it's hard to define with like a real sense of total confidence who I am. But I would say that the thing that I appreciate the most about who and where I am now is that I am living as authentically as I possibly can and showing up in a way that I am proud of and that I respect after many years of shrinking myself and not focusing on the things that I needed. And so I feel like there's just always opportunity to grow and to answer that question more. But right now, I'd say I'm very happy with who I am and what I'm doing.
I love that. And at the end of the day, we're always evolving. So even that's one of the reasons why I kind of add that. Who is Nikki today? Because we're
Yeah,
all
I like
much
that.
much different people today than what we were, yesterday, a month ago, or certainly 10 years ago. So it's just a constant journey and a constant evolution of trying to figure out who we are. So I love that. And again, I love. Um, I think this is going to be a great conversation because we really do share the same philosophy about the conversations we have with our guests, and like you, I love the opportunity to get on the other side of the mic too, and kind of again, it just gives you a different perspective as opposed to the person that's asking the questions and kind of loosely guiding the conversation. So I love that fact as well. So, just what made you get into podcasting in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So I was in probably at that point about my 10th year of my tech career. I had just moved out to Seattle. And like I had lost my job about 6 months before I moved out to Seattle and took a job with Amazon. To be honest, that was a pivotal moment in my life because I just bought a house in Pennsylvania, even though I was like, I'm not going to live here. I kind of felt like I had resigned to the life that I was living instead of the life that I wanted to live, and instead of pursuing the life I wanted to live. And so when the job opportunity came up with Amazon, I leapt at it. It was a nice pile of money that I desperately needed to get myself out of like student loan debt and other things. And the opportunity was huge. I knew it would be a great resume builder. But after about a year of being there and being at the company, I was so miserable. And I had already known that I didn't really think tech was for me, but I had graduated in '08 at the peak of the recession with a film degree. And it was like, nobody's going to pay you to do anything. And living in the States, like you need health insurance. And at that point, you couldn't be on your parents' plan. So I was like, I need a job, whatever I can do, I'll get a job, pay my bills, whatever. And so for the first time in my life, I think I was really miserable in a job. And I did feel like I had the option to ask myself why, not just to, hunker down and like get through it. And so I started going to therapy primarily because I was miserable with my job and really seeking a sense of purpose. And so after about a year of therapy, I really came to the realization that my purpose is to do this, to connect with people and to hold space for people to be able to have vulnerable conversations that create more compassion in the world, and hopefully then activate some change, whether that's for a listener who maybe sees something differently now that they've listened to an episode that impacted them, or a guest who has said to me, I've never shared this before, and then lets me in on this part of their life that has been hidden up until then. It really just became such an extension of myself to be a podcaster because I love to talk, if that weren't immediately apparent as soon as we got on the mic. But I also, over the years, have learned so much more to value the listening side of it and the growth that comes from that. So it was definitely, I think, initially from a place of personal desperation and feeling really lost. And then when COVID hit, what I didn't realize was that it was also the thing that was really keeping me afloat because I was in a very toxic relationship where there wasn't really much connection. And so it wasn't until I was out of the woods with that really that I was able to look back and say, oh my gosh, I think I stayed even longer than I would have. But it was because I was getting this connection with other people that was allowing me to find joy and empathy and compassion in this space where I felt very alone in a relationship, but I felt connected to the guests that I was talking to. So I was able to compartmentalize more. And so in that way, it was also a lifeline for me.
Yeah, I love that. And the connection part is so, critical, I think. And, in a day and age now, we're really, you know, taught to be polarized and taught to be in these
Yeah.
silos and everything. Human connection is still, such an important part of our lives. And I think a lot of times we lose that with social media. And, for myself, who, truly am an introvert at heart, but yet I can sit down and have a conversation with someone who, I literally met now 20 some minutes ago
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and, feel very comfortable in this space because immediately that there's a little bit of a common denominator going into the conversation as opposed to, like before we started traveling, I'd run a youth nonprofit organization and did a lot of community functions and networking events, and I hated those things with a passion because they were so shallow and so empty. Like if I went
Yeah.
into a
I get that.
networking, if I went into a networking event, I immediately sought out the people I already knew and hung out with them all night long. If they happened to introduce me to someone that I didn't know, then I might have grown my network by one or two. But me going
Hmm.
across the room and introducing to myself and handing them a business card was not going to happen. But yet in this space, I'm very comfortable. It really comes down to that human connection and being able to share that. And it's also one of the things about us traveling. that I found so refreshing is again being able to have that connection and just walking through a campground with the dog and he's generally the one that starts the conversation,
Aren't
and
they
then I
always?
I jump in, you know, but we all long for that connection regardless of what mainstream media wants to tell us and all that sort of stuff. I think you know we have so much more in common than what we don't, and if we just
Mm,
take the time to have these conversations, it's refreshing. It's what we need to move
yeah.
forward and to make the
Yeah,
world a
you're
little bit better
speaking
place.
totally, and you're speaking to my heart, particularly the piece about having more in common than we necessarily see or are even exposed to. To your point about the mainstream media, and this is something that I quite honestly, the past few years have been a very exploratory thing for me in terms of what I consume and really reevaluating like what I'm putting in to my brain and my body with like the negativity. And that's not to sit here and say like I never watch the news. I mean, I try to be aware of what's going on in the world. I think it's important to know. I also think that it can be a detriment to us when we start othering everybody because of what we're hearing and we're filtering it through this lens of what somebody said instead of having those own experiences, those personal experiences, like what you're describing with walking through a campground. And, some of the most beautiful relationships that I've made with people, even if they're fleeting moments, they happen organically and from a place of recognition of who somebody is sort of at a core level. And I mean, that's not to say, you meet a stranger and you're like, oh my gosh, we're new best friends. I've had that happen. I will be honest. And it's bizarre and great all at the same time. But I think that it's that open mindedness and open heartedness to be willing to connect with people. And, my mom is from New York. And so when we were growing up, we'd go to the city and you just kind of like zip around and you're not really paying attention. You're just kind of moving through the wave of people. But then I also witnessed her growing up talking to, the secretary at my school or the people at the dentist's office or whoever it might be. And so there was this real sense of engage with people in a meaningful way. And whether that connection is something lifelong or even just a few moments every couple of months when you see somebody, it can really raise your empathy, I think, and also just it gives you so much more perspective. Like just listen to other people and what they have to say and what they feel, because even if you don't agree with them, you at least have a better understanding of who they are. So then when you are interacting with them, you can have a more reasonable discussion.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's so important. Is just that perspective. It's just something that we kind of live in this climate that oh, well, if you don't agree with me in every aspect of my views, like I can't associate with you, and it's
Right.
so bizarre. It's like no, you know what? We can agree on these things and these things and these things, and we can disagree on these things and these things and these things, and we can still be friends.
Right. I think there totally. I agree with you completely. And I'll give as an example even like I think because the political divide is so great and we don't need to go down that rabbit hole entirely, but I think that there have been moments where I mean, I would get into like kind of knockdown, drag out verbal arguments with my parents at times about things where I'm like, take away what you're hearing everywhere else and just tell me what you feel is like the right thing, quote unquote, right? Like what is your belief? Where are your values? And the reason I would get in fights with them is because what they would tell me and then how they would act about certain things were not the same. And so it's like you're letting external things influence what you truly believe, because when you tell me what you believe, we believe the same thing. And so it's like you're trying to kind of unwind all of the mess that's shoved into our faces and our ears throughout the media and be like, okay, but who are you and what do you believe? And if at the end of the day, there is a mutual respect, understanding, and belief that, I think human equality is probably the thing where I personally draw the line, because it's like I feel like we're humans, like just let everybody have the rights that a human has. To me it is that simple. And so, and I'm going into this not knowing any of your perspectives, but I think that like that part of it for me is like you can have differing views and it can be and still have close relationships with people. I think where it gets more complicated and where we create more chaos in our world is when the values don't align and when those values are very deeply personal to certain people. And so if people start to feel like they're being attacked or that they don't have the respect that they deserve, then it becomes a lot of animosity instead of an attempt to understand and ground ourselves in the reality.
No, I completely agree with that. So yeah, and again, if it, you know, even that, I think if people would go into conversations looking more to listen than to talk, we could even break down those, you know, things for sure. And it's
Yeah.
like it's so bizarre to me because, you know, at the end of the day, again, we are all human beings, you know, and we are really driven by the same things. And if we would just take the time to listen instead of worrying about, I've got to push my point, you know, at the end of this conversation, I want her to see things my way, you know, like, no,
Totally.
let's
Yeah.
listen. Let's listen, have a conversation. Like that's the beauty of a conversation. It's listening, it's talking, it's actually communicating with each other. And
Yeah.
again, that's why I love, you know, hosting this podcast is, you know, I've got guests on my show that are just such a broad range, you know, everything from obviously other podcast hosts to life coaches to former professional athletes and Olympic athletes. And I've had people tell me, you know, like, well, you know, you don't have, you know, you're too broad. Like, you need to have more of a niche to grow your
Oh
listener,
man.
all that sort of stuff. It's like,
I,
no, I
we
don't,
preach to the
because
choir, my friend.
it's like, no, I don't, because at the end of the day, like, I love the fact that people listen to my podcast. Like, I love that. But at the end of the day, the conversations are really for me first and
Mm,
foremost, you know, for me to have conversations with interesting people and to allow them to tell their stories. And if people listen to it and are inspired, like, that's great. That's just a bonus. But at the end of the day, like, I want to have these conversations with people and listen to them. You know, so seems
yeah.
like your guest base is probably very broad as well from, you know, from what
It's
I know about you.
yeah, yeah, it's definitely it runs the gamut. Very similar varieties of life coaches, I will say. I don't think I understood how many different types of coaches there were until I started doing the podcast and I was
Yeah.
like, this is a whole different world of understanding for me. But then artists, musicians, neuroscientists, and just people who are genuinely passionate about sharing their story and the information that they have that can help other people. And that's the thing is I love that you bring this up for two reasons. One, to comment on the whole idea of like niching down. When I started the show, I was like, I want this to transcend demographics. And that from an ads perspective is kind of difficult. But I was listening to something the other day with Seth Godin where he was talking about the issue is also that we are looking at things still through the lens of demographic, which is, you know, okay, we're talking about the age, the gender, the location, et cetera, of people. But what we really need to be thinking about is the psychographic, which is that people who believe what you believe and to varying degrees, right? It doesn't have to be this, as you said, the same all of the time. But I really loved that distinction because that's what speaks to me when I do this show is that people who believe that we are all sharing in this human experience and that there is something to be gleaned from everybody's unique story. And so to your point about listenership, I don't expect that every single person who listens to my show, even consistently, will listen to every episode simply because they have an interest in the person who's speaking or the topic that's being spoken of. But what I do implore people to do is listen to some of those episodes that you might not think it are super interesting, maybe from the title that I chose, or maybe from like a social clip that I picked, but go in with an open mind and think about like, okay, what could I get from this? Because there are conversations that I've had, and I'm curious if you've experienced this as well, is I go in, I do my best. I found that I'm able to enter conversations with so much less judgment than I ever had before. And not that I was super judgy to begin with, at least I don't think. But that I really go in and I'm just an open mind. I want to absorb what people are sharing. And I've had some weird moments where I'm like, that's happening on this show, and I'm just gonna let it ride. It's just gonna be what it is, right? And it's something that I think, as much as I'm in a moment, I'm kind of like, okay, I'm caught off guard a little bit, but the whole point of this is to let somebody be who they are and for me to receive that as best that I can. Do you feel like you have moments like that because of
Yeah,
the range of guests that you have?
but yeah, I definitely have. I definitely have. There's definitely been some times where like, ooh, okay, but like you said, you gotta, you can't sit and say, listen to other people's perspective, and their views, and then when there's an opposing view that comes up on the show, sit and say, well, I'm not going to release this show because
Right.
I didn't like this, 3.5 minutes of what this guest said. You can't do that. I'm not going to edit it
Yeah.
out. Like, boom, it is what it is. And again, you can't preach it to people about listening to perspective and allowing people to have their voice and then not do it. Which
Totally.
there's a
Yeah.
lot of people out there who do that, who not necessarily in the podcast space, but again, when you go back to mainstream media and that sort of stuff, like they want to give somebody their voice, but then when they find out that voice isn't in direct alignment to theirs, and it's like, oh wait, we got to shut this down. All right, it's time to go. We
Yeah.
got to give our sponsors a shout out here.
Well, that's exactly it, right? And I think that's what honestly I've been challenged with in terms of moving the needle with the podcast growth too, is finding the things that feel really right to me to promote as part of it, and to be able to share insights that are really coming from a place of I get to support guests and what they're doing. Obviously I think part of the show is putting people's content out there, but when people join, or I invite them as a guest, or they reach out to be a guest, I'm very clear when people pitch me on something that I'm not here to give 5 tips for your best whatever. This is not what the show's about. If you have something that is relevant to the discussion, obviously feel free to bring that up. I mean, there are a lot of people who have books and their perspective through their books, that I really appreciate, and we can sit there and we can dialogue about it. But I'm not strictly promoting the book. I'm promoting the conversation that the book has inspired, right? And so I think part of it is, as you said, kind of knowing your boundaries and being like, I will or won't compromise on this. And I think that when you're independent, it gives you a lot more flexibility to say, okay, these are the conversations that I want to have. And that might mean that's at the cost of having higher listenership or XYZ other output. But at the end of the day, is it being true to who you are and what you believe and what you want? And I think that is the simultaneously the most gratifying and challenging part of doing this.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. And one of the things I've found just in general about the podcast industry, so to speak, is it's a community that does lift each other up. Like
For
the
sure.
two of us, being on this show, like I didn't go into this show saying, "Oh, I don't want to have Nikki as a guest on my show because maybe my listeners are going to stop listening to me and start listening to her show."
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's like, no, I want people to listen to Nikki's show. I want people to listen to my show. I want people to listen to, you know, whoever's show they want to listen to. And there's been
Yes.
so many times where I've had a guest who's also a host on the show, and then afterwards they've reached out to me and it's like, hey, I had a guest on my show that I think would be a perfect fit for your show.
Yeah.
Check this guy out, check this lady out. And that to me is just so refreshing because again, we're in this constant world of everybody like striving to be the top and just conquer the world. And in the podcast industry, very similar to the RV life, like it's a community that lifts each other up. And I think that's the thing that I love about it, and it's why I love having other hosts on the show because again, we're here to lift each other up.
Yeah. Well, one thing
Have
that
you
you
found
said,
it to be the same?
oh, sorry. Yeah. I definitely agree with you. It's really, it's something that I found at first, when I was starting, I was a little nervous because I didn't know anything really about the space and how interactive or non-interactive people would be. But as I've grown more in the community, I've found that to be exactly the same. And the thing is it's a bit regardless of what your podcast is about. I certainly think we congregate around people who have similar types of shows in terms of like the way that we run it or the topics that we discuss, things like that. But I think just overall platforms like Podmatch, for example, have done a really great job of offering that like very streamlined approach to the ability to connect with one another. And this is this is not an ad for Podmatch, but maybe because I feel like what's really cool about it is you can find people who have the same types of demographics, as you said, both for listeners and guests. And there are so many guests that I've had that I've recommended to other shows. And the thing is that that's a mutually beneficial thing, right? You're creating a good connection with a guest. You can then help them grow. They're obviously trying to get their voice out there if they're guesting. Now, a guest might not be a fit for every show. You might recommend somebody and it might not work out for the other host or for them, and that's okay. But I think there's an openness that, and I keep using that phrase, but it's true. There's just an openness and a willingness and a desire to help one another. And so I really feel like it comes from that place of wanting to be of service, which I think inherently as a podcaster is part of what we're trying to do anyway. We're trying to offer this space for people to share. And so, of course, we want to continue to promote what other people are sharing as best we can, especially if we feel like it was a educational or highly engaging conversation. The other thing that I will say is the amount of information that I've learned that through guests, like I had mentioned before, having this neuroscientist on my show, and I feel like I've mentioned him on so many episodes because the conversation is about his book, The Connected Species, and how we need to kind of get back to our roots as human beings where we collaborate and we function as a society instead of as individuals constantly. And another author who his name's Troy Hadid, and he looks at it from a very different angle, but it's like if we come from this place of love and we allow ourselves to look at us as like a collective we without isolating. And so a lot of the concepts are the same no matter how you're looking at it, but it's really incredible to see how different guests share that part of the story and then offer that enlightenment through the conversations that we have. And so those are the moments where you pick them up and you're kind of like, okay, this was a great conversation with this person, and I feel like they could be really good on this show because, for instance, my friend Bindi has a show called Ethical Evolution. And so she and I have had people who are like, okay, you should guess with this person. You should check out her show and see if you guys are a fit. And it just creates this really amazing web of creators. And it makes me think about what you said earlier about networking and how horrible networking events are. I hated them as well, like conferences, things like that. Like I never wanted to go, and I'm an extrovert, and I'm just like, oh, I recoil at the thought. But when you're doing that through a podcast community, it feels so different. It feels much more genuine.
I agree, absolutely. I want to shift gears just a little bit here and kind of
Go
revisit
for it.
something that you mentioned probably 20 minutes ago in the conversation. But when you talked about when you were relocating from Pennsylvania out west, and you're in a you were going to therapy because you hated your job and just totally miserable. And so many times in society, when we were brought up, it was like, look, so you hate your job, too bad, you got to make a living, just deal with it. Um, but you decided, you know, no, I'm not going to deal with it. Like I'm going to, create this new path and took that leap. How tough was that decision for you when like, because again, going back to us selling everything and jumping in an RV and driving around the country, like it was a painful process for me at first before even I bought into the idea. you know?
Yeah.
So what was it like for you kind of going through that? Like, I don't want to do this. I hate this. I need something different. Oh, I got to do this. That society says just stick with it and
Yeah.
just grind it out and yada, yada, yada. And then you go and like, no, I got to make a change. And then I just got to keep doing it. So what was that like for
Yeah.
you?
Yeah. I love that you asked that question, Dan. Okay. So that was a long time of back and forth. I was still at my job at Amazon for another 3 years. So part of that, I'll be completely candid, was the pay structure. I was incentivized to stay at least 2 years. And then if I stayed 4, it was the better benefit of the stock cash out and things like that, which frankly was necessary because I also ended up going through a divorce and that money was very useful. But I think that there was, once I realized that this is what I wanted to do, the push and pull was a lot harder to ignore. It sort of felt like everything that I was doing thereafter was trivial. And then when I lost my mom and I was leaving this abusive relationship, everything else seemed even more trivial. And I was like, this is stupid. Like, I'm not happy. I don't feel good about what I'm doing. I'm under scrutiny at a very difficult time in my life. And it felt like everything that I wanted in my life. And I remember because when I went to school for film, my thought was, I never want to have a desk job. And that was all I'd ever had. And I don't want to be stuck living like in my hometown. And that's what I had done. And so when I got out to Seattle, I was like, okay, this is my time to change things, even though I'm going to work for a company that I don't necessarily know that I would choose if the circumstances were different. And then I find myself like, you know, just grinding it out and being like, okay, fine, I'll just do it for this much longer. I'll just do it for this much longer. And you start to just chip away at all of these parts of yourself that you still really care about. But because you're incentivized by the external validation, the financial side of it was huge for me, because I was very broke and in debt for a while, having graduated at the peak of the recession with very minimal salary growth. And so I was really trying to build myself back up to a place financially where I could justify it. And so my plan was, after my 4 years at Amazon, to take the money that I had and go all in on myself with my podcast. I was like, okay, great. I'll have this much money. This will be good. That was when my mom passed away and this divorce was happening. I ended up having to give away a lot of money. And because of Washington State being 50-50, I won't go down that path, but like it was a very kind of unjust spread of the financial situation. And so because of that, I ended up having to continue working after Amazon, which was not the plan. And so that was really hard for a little while. I felt really derailed because I was already super, I mean, honestly depressed. I losing my mom was just super sudden and very much a distraction in my life. I think, as most people who've experienced that know, it derails a lot of your motivation. It can also inspire, which it ultimately did. But I was in this phase of just really trying to navigate, how do I get out of this hole, like this emotional hole, to be able to get to a place where I'm happy and I can do this thing that I really want to do. And so I took a couple of jobs over the last 2 years. That one I thought was going to be really great. It wasn't. It was actually kind of more toxic than Amazon was. And then I ended up being like, okay, I'm not going to do this. I can go all in on myself. And as I was about to do that, I ended up getting a contract role that allowed me to work like half time. And that was when this past year, I really ramped up. I was recording constantly. I've gotten episodes out every week, and that was comparatively to getting maybe one out a month in my first 2 seasons. And so I think for me, it was a function of, how do the circumstances align to allow me to have the security that I need to know that I'm going to be able to feed myself, house myself, etc., in an increasingly volatile market, while also pursuing this passion that I have. And a big part of that too is that I do now have a partner who is super supportive and very capable and wanting me to have this joy in my life. And so part of it was me being in the right place at the right time with the right financial security. And the other part of it was me being in the right place at the right time with somebody who saw my passion and said, you need to pursue this. You're miserable doing these other things. What can we do to make sure that you're okay and that you can live the life that you want to live? And so I know that was a bit long-winded, but believe it or not, that's the summarized version. And I think that's all to say, there was no like I'm just gonna do it moment until um I actually landed in a contract role where it was like I'm setting the boundary. This is how many hours I will work. And then I will make sure that I'm spending the rest of my time dedicated towards this thing that I want to do. So when that contract ends, I can go all in on it. And so that actually only just happened a couple of months ago.
You know, I love what you said there because I think, we all draw up a plan, and I think Mike Tyson said it best where, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. And, at that point, when you started getting a couple blows to the face, like you still, granted, you picked up, and things weren't happening in the timing that you were planning on it, similar to
Mhm.
our story when we were looking to sell our house, and then COVID came. We took the house off the market and we put it back on. We bought an RV. We had, a house payment and an RV payment, which wasn't part of our plan, but we kept
Right.
kept moving forward. So like, what was it that, that really drove you, that even with these obstacles that life kept throwing at you, you're like, no, man, I am, I'll pick this up for a little bit. It might slow me down, but I still got my eye on the prize. And, what was that main driving factor of just continuing to push? And I'm sure there are some points where you're like, screw it, I give up, and then you're like, no, we're going to keep going. It's
Yeah.
just that constant,
I,
again, that constant back and forth. Anybody who says like, no, I was laser focused the whole time, it never affected me, they're full of crap. I'll tell you that
yeah.
right out of the gate. So,
Yeah.
again, there's internal battles, and just, trying to stay focused with yet all this, craziness and distractions going on in your life.
Yeah. That's such a great question, Dan. I would say it really comes down to a sense of purpose. I think that that's a word that has kind of a buzziness to it now, but for me, there is this very visceral knowing that the conversations that I'm having are meaningful. As you said before, they're meaningful for me. And I also really believe that these are conversations that need to be had, not just because I want to have them, but because a lot of, we look at sort of the broader scope of podcasters and you see, sort of the biggest people, biggest quote unquote, people with the largest followings and audiences having guests who are talking about similar things, or the same guests kind of doing their circuit, which, as we've discussed, is sort of the same way it happens on an independent podcaster scale as well. But what I find really gratifying about being in the place that I am right now is that I'm not, yes, it's great to have the opportunity to have big names. That's great. But I also love that I get to help people share their stories when they don't have a lot of visibility. And even if it's just a few listens or a few watches on YouTube that their story gets, I feel like I'm helping create more understanding about ourselves and each other through these conversations. And so that purpose is so deeply tied to this desire to help us heal as humanity. And I talk about this in therapy. I understand it's a very big undertaking and that I'm single handedly not going to do that. However, it feels like the thing that I am here to do is to help people see themselves more clearly, help people challenge their beliefs and bring them to a place of not only better understanding of themselves, but each other. And that starts with having a better connection with ourselves so that we can create those more meaningful connections with other people. And that when I was in therapy and I came to this realization, like my purpose is to connect with people, it was like, but what does that even mean? Well, it started as these conversations, but in reality, it's the impact of those conversations. And I feel like that's what continues to drive me, because I know that it could be one person hearing it at the right time who turns around and is like, my life is changed for the better, whether that's in some small way or some massive way.
So one of the other things I want to talk about, you talked about the loss of your mom, and for someone who, you know, this podcast is called "The Journey My Mother's Son," dedicated to keeping my mom's legacy alive. And I lost her in 2005. Obviously, your loss is much more recent than mine, but yet that grief is never going to go away. It's always going to just evolve at
Mm.
times. And my mom's passing was very sudden as well. On a Tuesday, she was helping a friend change shingles on the roof, and on a Friday night, she passed away during open heart surgery. Um, so, you know, completely understand what that loss is like for you as well. But, tell me a little bit about, um, when that happened. Um, and again, you had a whole lot of other things going on in your life.
Yeah.
You know, just how did that affect you? And, how are you kind of using her memory now in what you're doing today?
Excuse me. Um, that's a really great question, and I'm happy to answer that. So it was February 2021, and I had left my ex in January to go back to the East Coast to stay with my family because things had gotten really bad. And so I was living with my sister for a couple of months, and I wouldn't have seen my parents for 2 years because of COVID at that point. And so I was lucky I got to see them, I think once in January and then once in early February again. And I was finally able to share with them things that I had been keeping to myself for fear of judgment that wouldn't have been there, for fear of, I don't know, reprimand maybe with some of my childhood anxieties surfacing. And so one of the last conversations I had with my mom at my sister's was with my mom and my dad, but specifically with my mom. And she had said to me, I just like don't know why you felt like you couldn't talk to us about this. And it was really challenging. But I had done a lot of work in therapy and finally got to a place where I could explain that part of it was the reaction that they had when I came out as gay, and that there was, while they were ultimately supportive, it felt like a lot of their response was about how they felt and not about what I was experiencing. And so I bring that up because I think that it was a really healing conversation to have. And then I'm grateful for that before before I lost her, before our family lost her. And after that, and right before she passed, excuse me, um, I was dealing with a lot coming at me from my ex and her family, and just like really just challenging me in a lot of ways to show grace and have patience. And I was able to share more with my mom because I felt like I had opened the door to us being more transparent with one another. And I felt like those last couple of weeks, she really was able to mama bear and step in and be like, that support that I really needed, and showing me that I could trust that she was supportive and present for me. And so when we lost her, it was the day. So my niece's birthday is February 20th. And so it was my parents' anniversary. So my parents had their anniversary together. We FaceTimed with them. And then the next day, my mom passed away super suddenly. And I believe some sort of heart attack, but nothing was sort of definitive. And it just happened in like the blink of an eye. And so there was nothing indicating that it would have happened. I just remember the night before even saying, like, you look so great, you guys look so happy. And so when I think about how much my life changed, hard to it's interesting because it's like so much of a feeling of sadness when I bring it up, but there's also so much empowerment that came from the loss, because I had asked my ex to come out to the services. I shouldn't have, in retrospect. I do regret that. But I felt like I need somebody here. I need somebody, to be supportive. And it was like, the thing is losing my mom showed me that my ex couldn't do the bare minimum, which I kind of already knew to be true, but like really, really when I needed her in like this moment of extreme loss, the worst fear that I had, that my ex knew was my worst fear, that my therapist knew was my worst fear, was losing my mom. And so when that happened and I didn't have that support, like that loss of my mom was the final push that I needed to be like, this is done. This is over with. I had left, and I had said that before, but I was with a narcissist. So I'm sure that I could have found myself wound back up in that circumstance. But it was like there was no more wiggle room. There were no more questions to be asked. There were no more conversations to be had. Like there was such a definitive sense of freedom with the loss of my mom, because it was like, I choose me now. And that's what my mom would have wanted for me. And so I think when I consider how it changed my life, it also gave me the ability to articulate my story more. Part of what I did to get back on the mic, because I had taken a year off from podcasting with guests, was I recorded, I think, 5 episodes where I just was processing what I had gone through in the last year. And I was like, maybe I'll do something with them, maybe I won't. And I ended up publishing them because it felt like I needed to acknowledge everything that I'd gone through, and I needed to acknowledge the way that that experience transformed me. And when I did that, it was a huge release for me. And it also, you know, it bonded my family more. It bonded my sister, my dad, and I a lot more. So even though I live on the West Coast, like I was staying with them for a really long time, my niece and nephew got to know me better. It was like she wasn't there, but her presence was still the driving force behind how we came together and how we were able to work through it. Yeah, and I apologize if this is sort of rambly. I'm sure, as you well know, when it's sudden, it's like there's just so many questions as to why, or like what could have been done. Or I don't know if this was the same for you. I had a lot of regrets because I was living really far away, and I'm like, I should have come home more, or I should have done this more, or I could have done that. And it's like you have to find peace in knowing that that isn't what that person was thinking. Um, and that's, I think, an ongoing evolution for me.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree completely. Uh, yeah, you know, I was living in Pennsylvania at the time. My mom was in Florida, so yeah, I can completely relate to what you're talking about there. So,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, I was really lucky because I was with my sister on the East Coast when it happened. And I will say that whatever type of divine timing, whatever that looks like, I was so grateful that I was not the entire continent away with my ex, having to navigate that back. But I was with my sister, and I was able to get to my dad within a couple of hours driving and be with my family and stay there and have that support with my friends and my family. So again, as much as it was tremendously devastating, it also felt like I was where I needed to be.
yeah, I think you can always find a silver lining in times like that. Where again,
Kind of have to, right? Like, I
yeah,
mean, I feel like it's the way to keep yourself sane.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, so, man, Nick, I tell you, we could kind of go on for hours and hours here, but this is definitely one of my longer episodes, and I think it just speaks to the connection that we've had here. But is there anything that you think we missed that you think would be valuable to the listeners before we wrap things up?
I mean, I think you've let me have my share of the mic on this episode. I really appreciate what you're doing, and it's just so beautiful to see somebody else with a similar mission and sense of desire to have this type of connection. So thank you for creating the show in this space.
Absolutely. So, Nikki, if anybody wants to reach out to you, they want to, subscribe to your podcast, find you on the internet, how do they do that?
Yeah, so you can visit whothefck.com and find links to all of the platforms there, wherever you listen to podcasts. Also on YouTube, is at whothefck_pod. I find that it can be hard with a typical search. So if you're struggling, visit whothefck.com, and there are direct links to wherever you want to go.
All right, awesome. And I'll put links to your website in the show notes as well. So, Nikki, that
Amazing.
brings us to the final question of the show. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is Many Little People in Many Little Places. It's inspired by the opening lyrics of a Michael Franti song, Gloria, which go, when many little people in many little places do many little things and the whole world changes. So even though you've probably answered this question multiple times throughout the show, here's your chance to kind of wrap it up and seal it up into a nice, quick answer. But, what's one of the little things that Nikki does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place?
You're probably right that I did answer this. I will say at a broad scale, it's being cognizant of connecting with people and, whether it's somebody that you quickly engage with at a store or you send a text message to that friend that you haven't talked to in a while, never feel like it's too late or it's been too long in between things. If you feel it, allow yourself to express that. I find that, a lot of times when that happens, it's when people need us the most.
Absolutely. I love that answer. Nikki, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. We get into your area of the woods there. We'll definitely look you up in our travels and get
Please
together.
do.
I've done that with several guests that I've had on the show and shows that I've been on. And it's great, again, to actually connect. This is cool doing the virtual thing, but the real connection is always so much better too. So, again, appreciate the
Absolutely.
time. For those out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. While you're there, pick up a copy of one of my books. And again, Nikki, thank you so much. It's a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Dan. I loved it.